Hello and good evening. I'm Bill Clary with Storm Surge here in Newburyport, Massachusetts. I'm pleased to welcome you to the Storm Surge Speaker Series and our October presentation by Dr. Amr Ibrahim. Dr. Ibrahim graduated from Drexel University College of Medicine, formerly the Medical College of Pennsylvania and Hahnemann University School of Medicine, in 1999. Following the medical school, he did his internal medicine residency and a following fellowship in gastroenterology at Tufts Medical Center in Boston. Dr. Ibrahim is board certified in gastroenterology, has published papers, and works in Newburyport and Haverhill, Mass. For Pentucket Medical Associates as a gastroenterologist. He is also affiliated with Anna Jakes Hospital in Newburyport and Holy Family Hospital in Haverhill. Dr. Ibrahim has said, "I have always had a strong interest in science, but I'm a people person too. For me, medicine provides the perfect opportunity to combine these interests. My specialty is gastroenterology, and I have a special clinical interest in treating liver disease. I choose this field because I am able to work with patients on preventative measures to improve their health and limit their risk factors for disease. He also has a long-term interest in climate change and health impacts. Tonight, he has prepared a well-prepared, multifaceted, and informative presentation for us. Please welcome Dr. Ibrahim to the Storm Surge Speaker Series gathering in October. Dr. Ibrahim.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Sarah and Bill, and also Sheila and everybody else at Storm Surge for helping put this talk together and for all the other great work that you folks do. My name, as Bill said, is Dr. Amr Ibrahim. I'm a gastroenterologist. I've been practicing here in Newburyport now for a little over 15 years. I work out of Pentucket Medical Associates here in the Newburyport office and also Endoscopy Center in Haverhill. I'm also on staff at the Anna Jakes Hospital here in Newburyport, the Holy Family Hospital in Haverhill, and technically also Methuen, where there are two campuses of one hospital now. And then for about 15 years was also on staff at Lawrence General Hospital. And we'll start off here by a quick disclaimer that really the opinions and ideas here presented are my own. And when you work in the medical field, everything has to have a disclaimer and all the T's crossed and I's dotted. So the opinions here do not reflect the opinions of my employer, Pentucket Medical, or my hospital affiliations or Storm Surge. And there are no financial disclosures or conflicts of interest that I have to talk about tonight. So tonight I'm really going to talk about climate change and health. And this, as you can imagine, is a very broad topic, which we could really talk for hours and hours about it. So I've tried to condense this down to about 40 minutes or so we can finish up and then have some time for questions. And I'm going to really talk a little bit briefly about climate change itself. And I'm not going to spend much time on that because obviously in this group that, pretty much we believe in climate change, we understand it, we're all here because we're concerned about it. And then I'll get into climate change and health and touch upon a variety of different topics about climate change and health, how it affects populations, how it affects individuals, how it can affect things through both air, water, availability of healthcare resources. And then I'll probably spend the most time on infectious diseases. And the reason for that is two or threefold. One is that everybody either they love to hear about infectious diseases and see the bugs and hear what they do, or they're completely grossed out and repulsed by them. The second is with the pandemic going on here with COVID-19, everybody really has a heightened awareness about infectious disease and what it can do. And then the third being, that's one of the most tangible things that I can talk about. A lot of the other things are harder to measure and harder to see if there's a cause or effect, but with infectious disease, you have the infectious agents, you can measure rates of disease. So it's one of those things that go along with my type A personality that I can measure and talk about. So briefly about climate change itself, we all know that climate change is occurring. It's a worldwide phenomenon. It's not isolated to one part of the world, and no part of the world is spared from this. The manifestations of climate change are vast, and they can include things from extremes in temperature and rainfall, mainly rising temperatures. We see extended droughts now happening. We see more severe flooding rains happen. We see more extreme weather in general, whether it be rainfall, but more manifest as tropical cyclones, thunderstorms, tornadoes, blizzards, these sort of big disastrous storms, as we would call them. We've noted rising seas, and then probably the most frightening thing is the rising CO2 levels worldwide. And some data, and I'm not going to talk too much about the data here, but there are a couple of studies that I found particularly interesting. One was a global climate survey, which really showed us that over the last 140 years or so, the average land and ocean temperature was increasing about 0.07 degrees centigrade per decade. And that's over, again, 140 years. However, over the last 40 years, that rate of increase has really doubled to 0.18 degrees centigrade per year. So really in the last 40 years, we've seen a doubling of the rate of temperature rise, and that's both ocean and air temperature. And then also various global analyses have also shown that the amount of water vapor present in our atmosphere has increased also, and this has been linked to human-caused warming. The concern with this is now we have higher temperatures, we also have more moisture in the air. That's literally the perfect storm. It's the combination of moisture and water leads to more storm systems having access to high energy, high moisture, resulting in these heavier rainfalls, these larger cyclones, tropical storms, thunderstorms, and whatnot. Another study that I thought was quite fascinating, this one was by Carbon Brief. It really showed that out of 350 or so extreme weather events and trends that were measured over the last, I think it was 10 or 15 years, almost 70% of them were found to be made more severe by human-caused climate change. They found that maybe 10% of the severe events were maybe made less likely by climate change. So, the raising temperatures and all that can sometimes help, that probably by decreasing drought in areas that are prone to drought, and perhaps, some of the temperate effects on areas where deep freezes and prolonged freezes happen. But clearly the negative effects outweigh any of the positives. And when they measured these things, they found that out of all these events that happened, almost 80% of them had some human impact. The other 22% may have not had any human influence or were inconclusive in whether human impact or change had anything to do with these severe or extreme weather events. They found that heat waves accounted for about half of such events, and then droughts, heavy rainfall, and floods were each about 15% of those events. And then looking at other studies, there were about 125 studies that were done that looked at extreme heat waves, and heat shock around the world. And they found that 93% of those extreme heat events were due to human or man-made climate change. And then again, 68 studies, so not quite as many, looked at rainfall or flooding, and found out again that about half of those events were due to some type of human activity causing it. And then for drought events, about 61%. So I'm not going to belabor this, but this really shows that, if for those people that don't believe in climate change, or that climate change is not affecting our environment and our weather, that this clearly, the proof is in the pudding here. And then we talk about, well, why do we worry about climate change? What is it doing? Why does this small, 0.2 degrees centigrade change in weather over time have a difference? Well, we've seen most of these things happen in the last even few years here, not just decades, and things like severe weather that I already mentioned, increase in air pollution. One of the things that I'm going to talk about for a good part of this talk is changes in vector ecology. So that's a fancy word for ecology most people are familiar with, but vectors are things that transmit some type of substance. In this case, transmit infectious disease. And the vectors that transmit infectious disease for the most part in our area are mosquitoes, bugs, and other waterborne pathogens. So we'll talk about how climate change affects these vectors and makes infectious disease more common and more severe. We'll also talk about how climate change degrades our environment and can damage not only the environment, but also buildings and structures. Climate change can affect water and food supply. It can affect water quality. It can also lead to an increase in respiratory allergens, which directly affects people's health. And this is sort of my outline that's not an outline, because normally when I like to give a talk, being kind of type A and organized, I like to go very methodically, walk through things, talk about a topic, then expand on it, give some data, then go through. But as we've seen in just what I've talked about already, this is all very interconnected. And the CDC here has this interactive graphic which really summarizes it best. And I'll kind of let this come up here. And the credit for this goes to the Centers for Disease Control. And it's a nice colorful diagram here which shows you, climate elements in the center of the circle. Then the next ring is really the one that's spinning around, shows the results of that, which is rising temperatures, more extreme weather, rising sea levels, increasing CO2 levels. And then the outer ring shows what those 4 elements cause in terms of direct effects. Many of those are things that we already mentioned, like severe weather, air pollution, vector ecology, increasing allergens, water impact, environmental degradation, extreme heat. And then around the periphery here are many of the things that I will sort of get into today. So we'll focus mainly on the infectious disease, which is I don't know if you'll be able to see my pointer on your screens, but all the infectious diseases listed here: malaria, dengue, encephalitis, hantavirus, Rift Valley fever, Lyme, chikungunya, West Nile. We'll talk some about respiratory allergens and asthma. We'll talk about the waterborne infections like cholera, crypto, Campylobacter, leptospirosis, algae blooms. We'll talk a little bit about heat-related illnesses and deaths, and then asthma and cardiovascular disease. Some of the other things like injuries, fatality, malnutrition, migration, civil conflict, mental health impacts mentioned here, we won't get into today just due to the time constraints we have. So getting into the meat of this, we'll start off by extreme weather. So if any of you know Froze, my wife, she knows that I have a slight obsession, we can call it, with the weather. So I'm always checking the weather, looking at the forecast. Once storms start to brew in the Gulf, I'm always looking at them saying, oh, this tropical storm, oh, look, this one's coming here. Oh, the past tracks, it's come our way. Oh, there's maybe a hurricane coming our way, or blizzards or thunderstorms or all of that. So for whatever peculiar reason, I've always kind of liked weather. So I'll start off with that. Some of the extreme weather events that we see from climate change are increase in these tropical, I mentioned tropical cyclones because we call them hurricanes here. They can be called typhoons in other parts of the world. And I forget exactly the naming conventions for where they're called typhoons and where they're called hurricanes, but really for us, it's hurricanes and tropical storms. There were so many tropical storms and hurricanes this year in our part of the world that we actually ran out of names. So typically they start, each year they come up with A through Z. I think there may be 1 or 2 letters that they don't use of names that they decide, let's put it that way. And then as they go through each storm, they kind of go through. So they got through, Z and ran out of names. So now they're calling them tropical storms or hurricanes: alpha, beta, gamma, delta. And I think delta is the current one we're at now. So these storms, pretty straightforward. They can cause significant damage and destruction just by their sheer destructive force and power. They can displace individuals from their homes. They can destroy crops, kill livestock, disrupt manufacturing. And some examples of how tropical storms and hurricanes can affect healthcare directly. The big example of this is Hurricane Maria, which last couple of years ago devastated Puerto Rico. When that happened, we actually were close to running out of IV fluids up here in mainland USA and in New England, because so many of those fluids and manufacturing plants were there in Puerto Rico, to where we actually had to start rationing IV fluids for patients for procedures, elective procedures. Normally we would hang IV fluids, and it's good to hydrate patients that have been fasting overnight. We had to really cut back on what we used, and on some younger, healthier patients, even that not even hydrate them, that just have an IV and sedate them through the IV and flush it, but not hydrate them. It was that dire for a few months. We've also had shortage of a lot of fairly common and straightforward medications due to different storms, both here and then a few years ago when Europe got walloped with a few storms. We've had a lot of sedative agents and anesthetic medications be in short supply. We've had over the last few years problems with getting certain antibiotics because of that. We've had some common cardiac medications be in short supply because of supply line disruptions due to these severe storms. So that's one way in which climate change really directly affects healthcare. It's actually short supply of the supplies that we need. Secondary things that can happen are you get increased standing water, you get increased temperatures. So where standing water is, mosquitoes come. When mosquitoes come, insect-borne illness arrives. And we'll spend a decent amount of time later on in the talk talking about mosquitoes and mosquito-borne illnesses. Some of the other things, and this one hits close to home here, is when we have these extreme weather events, whether it be large storms or even isolated severe thunderstorms with heavy downpours and rains, these can overload water treatment plants. And we see this right here in the Merrimack Valley. So when sewage treatment plants upriver become overloaded with large amounts of rainfall, discharge of raw sewage occurs in the Merrimack River. So this is called CSO, or combined sewer outflows. It's called combined sewer outflows because these are a lot of sewer plants where the storm sewers and the sanitary sewers, meaning coming from homes and bathrooms and toilets, are combined, so that water going into the storm sewers overflows or overloads the capacity of a sewage treatment plant to treat that sewage. What that would do is then lead to a backup of sewer lines. So then that sewage would back up through the sewer lines, sewer grates and manholes and storm drains would then kind of bubble out sewage, and you'd get kind of a nasty mess in the street or people's yards. But then that sewage would also back up in people's homes and basements. So to prevent that from happening, sewage is released in a supposedly controlled fashion to prevent that type of disaster, but then it creates a different type of disaster by releasing raw sewage into our river here. Other things that extreme weather can do, some of the indirect health effects. One is mental health issues, and this is probably one that's fairly overlooked because people sort of focus on, again, the infectious issues and then also on just the destruction itself, but then you forget how it affects individual people's mental health and well-being and anxiety. So if you can imagine, if your house had roof blown off by a tornado or a severe thunderstorm, that can certainly lead to PTSD and anxiety. Every time you get a storm now, you're not sleeping, you're worried, is some destruction going to happen? Your heart rate goes up, you kind of feel sick, you don't feel well, whatnot. Stress and anxiety from lack of food, lack of water, lack of power, lack of employment can happen. Your power goes out, you lose a whole fridge of food, that stresses people. You don't have water for 2 or 3 days because you live in southern New Hampshire, power goes out, you have well water, now you have no fresh water. You lose, if big storm comes out and it takes out your place of employment, you've lost your job. So this really creates a lot of fear and anxiety in people, and not only in sort of the anxiety PTSD standpoint, but also then stress and anxiety about areas that are devastated by these superstorms and people lose their jobs or their whole place of employment is destroyed. That's, how do you provide for your families in that situation? The economic devastation that I sort of mentioned also leads to issues in people's health too, that you again lose your job, that destroy factories, destroy businesses. You can also disrupt supply chains, like I already mentioned. So in addition to medical supplies, we've seen gas and oil prices rise after storms hit the Gulf Coast, or we see hurricanes in the area of the Texas coast there. And then we'll transition a little bit now from these extreme weather events to extreme heat. So clearly one of the big things when people hear or talk about climate change is global warming, and clearly that's happening. But again, a 0.5 degree increase in temperature in itself is not a big deal, but these 0.5 degree increases in temperature overall result in these concentrated periods of extreme weather, one of them being heat. So we see an increase, as some of the data I mentioned, increase in heat waves over the last few decades, and probably 50 to 60% of those heat waves, increase in heat waves, not the absolute number, but the increase is due to climate change. And that clearly can lead to heat-related deaths. So especially in lower income individuals that may not have air conditioning or access to air-conditioned facilities, and then really the elderly and those with cardiovascular or pulmonary issues are most at risk. So you've got the heat-related deaths from actual heat stroke and cardiac arrest and whatnot. We also have other heat-related illness that's less severe. So these are much more common. So you excuse me. So you have heat stroke, which is more severe, heat exhaustion, which is a little less severe. This really affects the majority of people that are affected by this are outdoor workers, the people that depend on their jobs, that have to work and they work outside. These would be, construction workers, farmers. We have, carpenters, the highway department folks, often, police officers and other security folks that are doing details during construction. All these people that have to be outside and have no other option with where they can work. And then again, elderly and those with cardiovascular issues are more severely affected, and then those without AC. Getting away from the people aspect of it, extreme heat, just like it affects people, it can affect our animals too. So we always hear about the unfortunate, dogs that get sick or die from being left in hot cars. We also have then, you think about our livestock, our cattle, our, goats, sheep, chickens, pigs, all our farm animals there. So they really have no place to go when it gets hot. They can kind of go in the barn or hide under trees, but that's really all they can do. There's no big air-conditioned barn waiting for them. So, that severe heat waves can wipe out livestock and decrease the food supply. Farmers can get loss of crops from heat damage and drought too, so that, growing fields can easily get scorched and can really take out a whole season's worth of crops in some areas, especially in certain crops that are sensitive to temperature. We also, with extreme heat, run the risk of increase in algal blooms and waterborne bacteria that thrive in warm water. So really anything that grows in water, for the most part, grows more when the temperature is warmer. So we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. Some of the other things that can affect water while we switch to that subject is you can also get an impaired access to fresh water with these heat events. So increased heat leads to increased evaporation. So smaller reservoirs of fresh water like ponds can certainly dry up. And then certain areas where there may be high mineral content or whatnot of those freshwater supplies, if you evaporate off half the water, now your mineral content goes up. So then that water that was previously usable to either water crops with or to drink now may be unusable. The increased temperature of water in our oceans, lakes, and streams can also affect how our fish live. So like I said, many things grow more vigorously when the water's hot, or not hot, but warmer. Most of those are kind of the nastier things like the bacteria, the algae, that type of thing. Some fish are very resistant to temperature, but a lot of the fish that we eat, like salmon and some of the other fish that we call cold water fish, are very sensitive to temperature. So if you get increased temperature of water, it can actually change the actual habitats where our fish grow. We can also see increased growth of algae and bacteria. And this, I mentioned, we talk more about, happened right here in the Artichoke Reservoir here in Newburyport. Now, some of that may have been with the help of some cattle, perhaps, that were, wandering through and going to the bathroom there. But I think that is up for debate whether that really made a difference or not. But we certainly did notice that the temperatures were fairly warm this summer. We didn't have a lot of cloudy days, didn't have a lot of rainy days, so the temperature in that reservoir certainly increased. The bacteria then multiply faster. that can lead to reservoirs and bodies of water becoming tainted. We can also, in this case, what happened is this algae grew that could release a toxic compound there that could contaminate the drinking water. Luckily, that didn't get to that point, but we got close. And then increased temperature water can lead to these algae and whatnot that can cloud the water too. So then what that can do is prevent sunlight from hitting the depths of certain bodies of water where certain essential plants, and whether it be seaweed in the ocean or other aquatic plants and freshwater bodies, tend to grow. Sorry. So I'll change gears again here for a few moments and talk a little bit about some of the waterborne infectious diseases. So some of these slides are somewhat busy with a lot of information. I put a lot of these words up here just so that people have that for reference. And I'm just going to kind of go over some of the more common infectious etiologies and what they do, and then we'll sort of move on to our next topic then after that. So cholera is a big one. This is probably one of the more common waterborne illnesses worldwide, and it is caused by a bacteria that's called Vibrio cholerae, and it's actually an infection of the small intestine by these bacteria. And the symptoms of cholera are they range. It could be mild, it could be severe. The classic symptom is really just this watery diarrhea that lasts a few days. You can get vomiting and muscle cramps. Again, healthier people tend to do well with it. Older folks and people with multiple medical problems can become clinically dehydrated and run into trouble. With a good rehydration solution, though, this tends to pass on its own, and most people can be managed by just staying well hydrated. Cryptosporidium is one that we hear a decent amount in our area. So crypto, as we call it, it's a microscopic little parasite that can cause a diarrheal illness. And this parasite is particularly tough to get rid of because it's got this hard outer shell that lets it survive for long periods of time outside the host's body, and it actually makes it very resistant to chlorine disinfection. So it takes a lot of chlorine to really get cryptosporidium. And that's why if you ever look at our every 6 months water quality reports that come out from the Newburyport Water Department, it sort of talks a little bit about cryptosporidium there too, and talks about the water supply and immunosuppressed people drinking and whatnot. Because for somebody who has a good immune system, crypto typically doesn't cause a problem, but because it's hard to completely eliminate due to the amount of chlorine that would be needed, people with depressed immune systems can get a diarrheal illness from drinking even treated municipal water that may have low levels of crypto in it. Typically, it's spread by water, mainly drinking water, and also recreational water, meaning ingesting water while you're swimming in rivers, lakes, and streams. It is actually the most common cause of waterborne disease among humans in the United States. And like I said, most people it resolves on its own. Immunosuppressed people or people with severe cases may need an antiparasitic medication to get rid of the infection. Campylobacter, now this is one of our favorites that we see in GI. It's not really one of our favorites, but we see it quite a bit, and it causes about 1.5 million cases of diarrheal illness in the United States each year, so fairly common. You can get it many ways, really by eating raw or undercooked food. It could be in poultry, it could be in seafood, meats, produce. Less common by contact with animals that may carry Campylobacter, and even less common than that, drinking untreated water. We don't see a whole lot of Campylobacter in water in the United States, but in other parts of the world, we certainly do. And this causes fever, abdominal pain, diarrhea, often bloody diarrhea starting a few days after you ingest the Campylobacter. Often these people, because they do have bloody diarrhea, end up in the emergency room. They get evaluated. They often have abnormal blood work. Stool cultures are done. Often the stool cultures, interestingly, because it is a hard to detect organism, 50% of the time, even if you do a stool test and they have Campylobacter, the test may not be positive. Typically, in most people, they get better on their own. You can treat severe cases with antibiotics. most of the time, if we see people in the office with this and they're doing okay, we hold off on the antibiotics. If they're sick enough to be in the emergency room, we will give them a short course of antibiotics to treat. Leptospiridiosis. So this is another bacterial illness. It's a lot rarer than the two that I talked to. It's spread by the urine of infected animals. So it could be cattle, pigs, horses, dogs, rodents. So it's a common farm transmitted, or not a common, but it's most commonly transmitted in farms or those type of settings. It can actually survive for weeks or months in soil. So that's its claim to fame, is that, you know, even if the animals that were carrying it did their business and then they're gone, the leptospirosis can survive in the soil for quite some time. This really gives most people fevers, headaches, chills, muscle aches, vomiting, jaundice, which is yellowing of the eyes or skin, abdominal pain, diarrhea, and a rash are the most common causes. So often not really distinguishable from the flu, or I guess these days COVID. And the scary thing of leptospirosis is that it can actually cause kidney failure, liver failure, and meningitis, which is an inflammation of the brain, and a really much more severe, life-threatening illness there. The good news with this is it is treatable by antibiotics. Unfortunately, because it can be so severe, it's a good thing we don't see this that often. I'm going to change gears for just a moment here and come back to algae. So I talked a little bit about algae and the algal blooms in the artichoke reservoir here, and I just wanted to talk a little bit more about that. And this little diagram here sort of breaks up the two different types of algal blooms. So on the left, we see freshwater. So freshwater algal blooms are promoted by warm, still water. So again, you know, warm is the key, and then kind of still waters. Things that can cause more growth of algae in fresh water are increased nutrients in that water, mainly nutrients not like what we think of as food, but nutrients for bacteria, like things like phosphorus and nitrogen. And where do phosphorus and nitrogen typically come from in water? That's runoff from fertilizers. So, you know, fertilizing farms, fertilizing your lawn, plants, that runoff can actually lead to an increase in algae blooms in fresh water. In brackish or marine water, now brackish water is sort of where there's a mixture of fresh and salt water. So that'd be things like, you know, the mouth of the Merrimack River and that, or in the deep ocean. One thing is the increase in sea surface temperatures, which we talked about earlier, a change in the sea currents. So that really, what that means is, you know, if sea currents are moving in one direction and temperatures are one way and the flora under the surface is in balance, we're good. But then if sea currents change due to outside climate effects of changing wind patterns or whatnot, and then there's a sudden change, usually increase in ocean water by a change in direction of which currents are going, that can lead to increased algae in the ocean. And then also weird weather patterns and changes in winds and other things, and certain, you know, what we call storm surge itself, when there's wind blowing and it piles water up against a body of land, can actually cause nutrients to accumulate at the surface of the ocean, and that could lead to algae that normally live in the water to proliferate up near the top surface. And like I mentioned, these algae can produce toxins that can poison humans. They can poison a lot of the animals we depend on, and also our pets. It can actually make somebody sick from eating a fish or eating shellfish that's contaminated with these algal toxins, which is a little scary thought. And then, as I mentioned about sunlight reaching depths of waters. And then the other thing that I did mention earlier is that these algae, because the way that they go, and certain algae are plants, but many of them are other mixture of plants and protozoans and single-celled organisms, they can actually remove oxygen from the water of plants to starving fish and aquatic plants. The overgrowth of the plant-based algae actually would put oxygen back, but typically, again, the imbalance in the way they grow, we tend to lead to more oxygen starvation. Some of the respiratory things that we see from climate change, most of these are fairly easy to understand and common sense, but the most common is air pollution itself can cause asthma, and it can exacerbate asthma in people that have underlying reactive airway disease. We've got ground level ozone, which is very different than the ozone layer. So it's the same compound, ozone, but if it's up in the stratosphere, 100 miles above, what it does is it protects us from UV rays of the sun. But then we get ozone down at the ground level. That's one of the contributors to smog, and that ozone can be very irritating to people's airways, and especially those people with asthma. And as we've seen before, the elderly and children are most vulnerable from this. We also have particulate emissions. So ozone is really a compound. It's not a particle that you can really easily filter out. Particulates are things that we get basically from exhaust that you can think of as soot. So we see that in older diesel emissions, so older trucks, cars, farm equipment that do not have particulate filters. These days, most trucks, buses, and cars, all that to be sold for on-road use, do have particulate filters, so that's decreased some of that. But farm machinery and marine diesels are exempt from those rules. We also find that boats, motorcycle, and lawn equipment without catalysts also release a lot of particulates. So again, since 1975 or 1976, vehicles have had emission controls that has really cut back that particulate emissions by, anywhere from 70 to 90%. But then most motorcycles, lawnmowers, and that type of equipment, and boats I'll talk about a little bit because they're sort of in a hybrid class there. So those type of smaller engines do not have emission control, so they release a lot of particulates. Most boats that I've seen in New England, and I should have reviewed this before to see what is the actual rule to have them, and I don't think they're regulated that they have to have emission controls, but a lot of the boats on the water that have the 4-cycle engines or 4-stroke engines do tend to have some degree of emission control, not quite as pristine as what you'd find on a car. The not older, because they still make a lot of 2-cycle marine engines too, that those tend to be where they mix the gasoline and the oil together, combust that, and you lubricate and power the engine with the same kind of mixed fuel source, tend to have more particulate emissions. So asthma is really a big issue. We've seen rates of asthma rising over the years, and this simple chart here, and it might came across a little fuzzy, but it really just tends to show that, we think of pollution happening, more so in, California with its smog, and then, other developing countries like India and China and all of that. But, you look at this, I was a little surprised when I saw that the highest rate of asthma in children due to pollution in the world was Lima, Peru. I wouldn't have guessed that. Shanghai, China, wasn't quite so surprised about. Bogota, Colombia, then Beijing and Tianjin, China. Toronto as number 6 surprised me. Los Angeles didn't surprise me, but then New York again kind of surprised me. So it just shows that, even in some of our cities that we don't perceive as being, these dirty, high polluted cities, we see a lot of effects from this. Allergies that are sort of related to asthma. So asthma affects the lungs themselves. Allergies affect the upper airway, sort of in the nose and the back part of the throat there. We find that climate change directly affects allergies. So this was one of the facts when I was preparing for this talk I found very surprising. So between 95 and 2011, warmer temperatures across the globe have led to an increase in the US pollen season by 11 to 27 days on average. The flowers are blooming earlier and longer because of not only the temperatures, but also the increase in ambient CO2. So these plants flower longer, more pollen is in the air, more allergies. And then the last part of the talk here that I'll kind of move through this quickly because we're already getting to 7:40, are some of the kind of creature-borne or critter-borne infectious disease. So these are always fun because, one, I can show you pictures of bugs and spiders and ticks and those kind of things that, again, people they're fascinated by them or they find them repulsive. And the other interesting part of this is that a lot of these are common in our area. So I've relisted the things that were on that CDC slide there, and what I'm going to do is really focus on Lyme, West Nile, and encephalitis, because these are all very common in our area. And then I'm going to mention malaria because it's so prevalent worldwide. The other ones, well, you know, they have names that are fun to say, like chikungunya and dengue and hantavirus. I'm really not going to delve into due to time restrictions. The first one that everybody's familiar with Lyme. I don't think there's anybody that lives in New England that hasn't heard about Lyme. Here's a close-up picture of a tick. So they really are, and I probably should say this in public, but I do think that they're just kind of nasty creatures. They're really just what they do. The amount of illness I've seen them cause for such a tiny little creature is pretty stunning. So most of the Lyme in our area is caused by a bacteria. It's called Borrelia burgdorferi, and it's transmitted by what we call these black-legged ticks, or back in the day when I went to med school, we used to call them the deer ticks. Very common in our area. It's called Lyme disease because a big area where it was first studied and discovered was Lyme, Connecticut. It can cause anything from very mild disease to very severe disease. Typically, when you get bit by a tick, you see this little target type rash if you've gotten bitten by an infected tick. And that's really the most effective time to treat it. So if you catch it early and treat it when you just have that rash, people tend to do very well. But if it's not treated or the antibiotics aren't successful at that point and the Lyme disseminates, then you can get fevers, headaches, fatigue, skin rash. It becomes harder to treat. And then in some cases, people can get a chronic Lyme infection, which is very, very, very difficult to treat. Early treatment is the key, and prevention is also the key. And prevention really is fairly straightforward, using insect repellents and then also removing ticks quickly. And when you're out in woods or in areas where there are a lot of ticks, really just checking and having somebody else check you for ticks, because when you're checking yourself for ticks, you really can't see your back and the back of your legs and other areas where ticks like to hide, you know, back in the nape of the neck here. And then also checking your animals or pets that you're out walking with for ticks. West Nile is another issue that we see in our area here. Every few years we see, you know, a bump in West Nile, and you'll hear, you know, the alerts going out to watch out for mosquitoes, avoid going out during high mosquito activities. And this is one of the leading causes of mosquito-borne illness in the US. So while Lyme is really common in the Northeast, countrywide, West Nile is more common. It's spread by the bite of an infected mosquito again. The hard part for West Nile is we don't have a vaccine to prevent. We don't have a medication to treat. So about 1 in 5 people get symptoms. So 4 out of 5 people may not even have symptoms, or they just feel like, you know, they're under the weather and then it's gone. 1 in 5 get fever, aches. That tends to pass, not a big deal. But 1 in 150, so, you know, about half of 1%, get severe disease and potentially fatal complications. And again, the hard part here is that there is no real medication to treat. So these people, when they develop severe illness, you hospitalize them, you treat them supportively, and you hope that their immune system can battle this. So prevention is really the key. It's prevention, prevention, prevention. So again, insect repellents. And then if you're going to be out in areas where there's a lot of mosquito activity, you know, long sleeve shirts, long pants, and then really avoiding being outdoors during mosquito activity time. Encephalitis, another mosquito-borne illness here. It's rare, but it can be very severe when it happens. And it's called encephalitis because it causes a inflammation of the lining of the brain and the tissues that surround the brain. The scary part of this one is it has a 30% fatality rate. And many of the people that do survive it can also have long-lasting neurologic complications. So most people that get it and survive through it, a lot of them do not escape unscathed. And it's transmitted by mosquitoes in a cycle with birds in freshwater swamps. We do see this in our area, and you know, we do have monitoring for it that goes out. So when we find some AAA, I think like there was some earlier this year, the alerts go out and say it was found in this county, in that county, or in this town. The symptoms are very similar to a lot of the other things that I've talked about. It's sort of the fever, chills. Malaise is sort of the medical word for just not feeling good, tired, achy, just kind of that under the weather feeling. Also get joint pains, muscle pain. Illness can last 1 to 2 weeks. And the scary part here is there's, again, no approved treatment. And lastly, I'll talk quickly about malaria. So this is a mosquito-borne illness, not very common in our area. It can affect the liver and blood. The key symptom of this is this relapsing fever. So you get these high fevers that then come and go in a cycle of every, I think it's 8 to 12 hours. We see this mainly in tropical and subtropical areas. We see it more in our areas coming back from travelers that may have gotten the malaria and then they come up to our area and then spread it. Hold on 1 second here. I'm going to switch my audio here. I just ran out of power on my headphone here.
Okay, I'm just going to switch over to the computer audio. I just got an alert that the batteries were running critically low there. So there we go. So the malaria is treatable and it's also preventable. So there are anti-malarial medicines to prevent and then also treat. So as time is getting short, I'm going to kind of talk fast here and say, how can we help vulnerable populations that are affected by climate change causing issues with health? These are really, this itself could be a talk for a whole day worth of workshops. And it's really getting those institutional changes and things in to really get people healthcare, housing, and sanitation. So it's really a difficult question to answer. It's really simple things that aren't simple is helping communities, provide adequate housing for everybody, having well-funded public health care systems and structures, making sure people have actually access to healthcare so that they have insurance or ability to seek out healthcare in areas where there are people that are either uninsured or underinsured or maybe at risk, having community health centers that can help get those people in and get them cared for. The public health messaging, getting those alerts out when problems happen that, everybody doesn't think about looking for EEE alerts or other mosquito-borne illness alerts there, so that to really get that message out, getting people to know what that means. Again, you put an alert out on TV that says EEE virus has been found in North Andover. Well, the Spanish-speaking population in Lawrence, that's one town over, may not really understand that or understand what that means. The public education on topics around conservation, recycling, composting, decreasing carbon footprints, things that we can do to prevent the issues from happening in the first place. Making sure that we have good access for our highest risk populations to good healthcare, so our pediatric and geriatric populations. And then again, it sounds redundant, but it's really education, 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 making sure that medical providers are educated on how this affects people, the public is educated on how this affects them, and our communities are educated on how they can come together. What can we do as individuals or as groups? One is you have a choice when you use energy. Make choices when possible to try to use more clean and renewable energy sources when possible. That's not always easy to do, but it's worth a try. Drive less. If you live close to downtown Newburyport or you live in a neighboring town and you can ride your bike or walk, that's one thing. Use public transportation. If you live where you need a car, then try to consolidate your errands and trips so that you're not, driving 3 times to the same place in one day. Or when it's colder out, consolidating the trips lets your car warm up and stay warm so that it pollutes less when it's up to normal operating temperature than when the engine's cold. Don't idle, that's a big one. Idling these days, really, it just causes pollution, it wastes fuel. Most cars nowadays warm up very quickly. You do not need to preheat them because they won't stall when you put them in gear like the cars of the 70s did. They actually, the way that most engines are designed now, they warm up fastest when you drive them gently. They will take, because they're so efficient, they will take much longer to warm up when you idle. So that's a big one. You know, avoid energy hog appliances. So the clothes dryer is my favorite one to pick on here. It takes energy to dry your clothes, but then it also sucks the air in your house that you've already heated or cooled, blows it through your clothes, and then exhausts it outside. So one of my big things, and my wife laughs at me because I hang up clothes inside the house to dry. In the winter, I hang them up outside when it's summer. But that, in looking at how much energy a clothes dryer uses, if you add that up by how many dryers we have in the country, the numbers are stunning. And then making energy efficient choices when buying cars, appliances, HVAC equipment. I know we're getting close to 8 o'clock, but what I will do is turn it back over to Sarah here, who will take questions. I'll answer as many questions as we have time for. I know the town halls are starting at 8, but we'll certainly stick around to answer questions beyond that. Anybody that wants to go and watch those, feel free to log off and do that. Anybody that wants to stay and ask questions, feel free. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Amar. We have a couple questions from the chat just to get us going. One is, what can we do to improve our resiliency to respond to these health issues? And the second one is, are there tests to diagnose all these diseases? Does testing need to improve as climate changes?
So both very good questions. So the first one is a tougher one to answer because, you know, what can we do to increase our resiliency here? I think a lot of that is really going at it from a public health standpoint, speaking about health in general. And by public health, I mean, you know, having people aware that these issues occur, which I think in our area, we do a decent job about having the alerts and disseminating the information about Lyme and the Triple E and some of these other mosquito-borne things, the algae blooms that, you know, conserve water, don't waste water because we have issues. But I think that can certainly be improved. I think the other part of public health is then having access to healthcare, which I think in the Northeast, we're very fortunate where we do have a lot of access. We have, you know, good community hospitals like Anna Jake's here. We have, you know, Holy Family in Haverhill, Holy Family in Methuen, Lawrence General in Lawrence. We have the Greater Lawrence Community Health Center in Lawrence. There's a Greater Lowell Community Health Center in Lowell. So we have access to healthcare that is good in our area, but in other parts of the country and in rural areas, that isn't the case. So really getting that access to people, both in terms of having physical access, meaning is there a healthcare facility that you can get to close to where you live? And then the second is making sure people then have some type of insurance so that when they can get physical access to healthcare, it doesn't become a financial burden for them not seeking out care because they can't pay for it. And then what was the other question there, Sarah? Can you say that again?
Are there tests available to
tests.
all of these diseases?
Yes, so for all of these infectious issues, we do have tests for. The tests are widely available, and most of the time, if you present with the symptoms and common things have been ruled out, most physicians, whether it be the ER or gastroenterologists or infectious disease docs, would order the tests. As these things become more common, I do think it is important that, and this is on our standpoint as healthcare providers, is educating ourselves through continuing medical education opportunities to really be familiar with these things, know the incidence in your community, so know when you should suspect it and order the test. So that was an excellent question.
Let me just suggest people, if you'd like to unmute and ask questions. We don't have a huge group here, so we don't have to make it too formal. So if you just want to unmute yourself and ask a question, feel free. And we've got one more from the chat while we're waiting here. How do our food choices affect our resistance to disease and climate change?
That's a good one. That's another, I think, whole day answer, but I'll try to be brief here. So I think food choices in terms of climate change and also health in terms of climate change itself, food choices really by picking things that are as few degrees separated from the sun as possible. And if you say, what the heck does that mean? That really means, going towards things that are plant-based, that are getting their energy from the sun, that are really that first degree catching the energy of the sun there. So really plant-based foods in terms of avoiding climate effects, getting food that's sourced locally, things that do not need to be transported long distance causing pollution and that's especially important for things like if you're going to second or third degree things in the food chain, like, most people are not going to just eat plant-based only, people do want meat and other types of protein. So then you want to try to get meat that's sourced locally. So at least, even though the way it works is the sun's energy is captured in the plants, then the animals eat those plants, and then we eat those animals as meat, then at least, that's still happening, but you're not transporting them across the country in a truck that's then spewing carbon emissions. In terms of health in general, it's really making healthy food choices, which it's easy and it's not. It's, again, going with low fat, high fiber, lots of fruits and vegetables, antioxidant fruits, not overeating. When you do eat things that have fats in them, you want to stick with the non-animal healthy sources of fats like avocado and olive oil and that, as opposed to meats and deep fried things and cream based. So that sounds conceptually simple. But then when you apply that to prepare those types of foods, it actually takes time, so that you have to have the time and resources to do that. And then when you get to talking about our vulnerable populations of the elderly who now may have limited incomes or have limited mobility or ability to cook, or are folks that are financially challenged, that healthy food, unfortunately, it's a fact, is more expensive to buy than crappy food. And, so it becomes a whole sort of public health, national health issue as well. But the basic tenets are more plant than animal based, eat locally, and eat healthy.
Excellent. Merck, can you unshare your screen so that
Okay.
I think it's blocking the share of the question
Sure.
slide. So I don't know if people can now see, there's a slide that I'm sharing that shows how to ask questions or how to raise your hand. If you're watching on the televisions and you want to dial in, there's several phone numbers, but one you can use is 1-929-436-2866, and that will get you into the call to ask a question. So does anyone in the audience here want to unmute and ask a question?
I'll ask a question. This was great. Thank you, Dr. Abraham. Education, education, education. How do we get the word out how do we educate? I would love to see it start in school. Kids are so good at absorbing this stuff and taking it home, but there's so many people that just don't believe it or don't know about it.
That's a great question. And I think in terms of schools, having 2 kids in the school system, I am seeing this in the schools. Like, my kids are learning this. They are, they talk about the water crisis. They talk about, food scarcity. They do talk about, climate and that. And I've heard, both kids talk about it. My 6th grader, Anya, actually was helping me with, ideas as I was talking about this as well. So I think, the schools are incorporating this, which is good. So I think that's starting there. And I think those kids hopefully are, at least bringing it up at home. The hard part is then when the kids bring it up and then the adults are, like you said, don't believe it or don't want to hear it. The other part of it, I think, is there's not a great answer. People that don't want to believe it, won't. But what we can do as individuals is still, talk about it with people. I think a lot of these things, when you have that one-on-one conversation or small group conversation with somebody that you know, or somebody that you may not know, that's in the presence of somebody that you do know, then when they hear it that way, it at least gets the gears thinking, and that idea can at least get into somebody's sphere of reference, to where when they hear about it later, or they talk about it, or they say, oh yeah, I don't believe this, whatever, then at least something clicks and says, oh yeah, but then I heard so and so talk about it like this. And I've kind of found that to be most effective. These type of forums like this are great, but every time I do something like this, or if I'm also, the other thing I do besides work and raise kids is I'm on the Human Rights Commission here in Newburyport. And when we meet to talk about issues in that sphere, it's always, when you do a forum, you get people together, you always get the like-minded people there, and at the end, we always feel like, well, we're preaching to the choir. It's all the like-minded people that already get this, that have come to this event. How do we reach out to those that don't get it, or don't understand, or don't want to understand? And that's really always the perennial challenge. And that's where I found those things, just having those random conversations with somebody that you have to make yourself a little uncomfortable to start that conversation, because you're going to say, well, this person's going to say this to me or whatnot. And you have to put it out on the line there and say, you know what, I'm going to say this anyway. I'd like you to at least listen to what I have to say. You may not have to believe. And it's also the way you talk about it. If you act and give somebody a lecture and say, well, this is what I believe and this is right, and if you believe otherwise, they're going to shut down. But if you do it in a way that say, you know what, hear me out, or let's agree to disagree, but listen to what I have to say, I found you can turn a few people around, at least, with that technique. Thanks for the question there, Judy, and nice to see you there too.
I had one I'd like to ask myself. Earlier in the presentation, you mentioned the impact to the global supply chain with the Hurricane Maria, I think it was. And then we've obviously seen the PPP issue, issues with the COVID. Do you see any initiatives to address the sort of global supply chain issues that are obviously going to be impacted more and more?
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question. And yeah, with the COVID, we really got caught with our pants down on that one, where so much of our medical supplies and PPE is sourced from outside the country, and mainly from China. And clearly what happened was, this hit first and hardest in China, so that's where the stuff was made. And then clearly it was needed there, so the country that's manufacturing it they've got access to it, so they're going to use it. So that decreased what we were able to get. I have seen some, and it's hard to see the true effects of it, because you hear about it, but unless you actually see it happen. But I have seen a lot of, in terms of the PPE that we're getting and we're using, and we're seeing different companies, different brands of things that are, at least they're labeled made in the USA now, that we've seen. A lot of the things like the gowns and the face shields and that type of thing. So that I think a lot of that manufacture is happening. And I think companies whose other product lines were sort of shut down because demand went way down due to pandemic, some of them sort of ramped up to do it. Like a lot of the automakers and other factories that were not producing what they normally did switched over to make emergency supplies. And while that's happening right now in this crisis situation, the really only hope to prevent these kind of issues in the long run is really to kind of bring manufacturing back to the US, really start making things here again, rather than procuring everything from abroad. And that's clearly easier said than done, but we've seen it happen with the PPE and a lot of the supplies. A lot of our other companies that make the N95 masks and all of that, like 3M and that, they sort of were, some things were manufactured here, some outside the country. And I think they're clearly, 3M is one of our big suppliers of N95 masks in the hospital in our practice. And I know our purchasing people when they've discussed with that these companies are ramping up what they're making here in our country. So I think that that's a promising sign. But I think it's that somewhat cliche, but it's, you know, we got to make our stuff here.
Yeah. Okay, are there other questions people would like to jump in? All right, I
Shy,
think,
shy group.
yeah.
Well, good. Well, Dr. Ibrahim, I want to thank you on behalf of Storm Surge for your presentation. It was very informative, and I really enjoyed some of your comments. To Dr. Ibrahim and everyone else, this session has been recorded, and it will be put up on our website for future use, including at schools for education purposes, hopefully. So it'll be available. I think there's basically links to YouTube. So, but anyway, again, thank you very much for your time and very thoughtful presentation. I'm sure it'll just encourage some other discussions as we go forward. So thank you very much.
No, thank you guys. Thanks everybody who helped put this together. And like I said, just to Storm Surge in general for all the good work that you're doing. I know it's often thankless work, but it's important work. So great job.
Just
Everything that you guys do.
thanks to everybody who's called in, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and look forward to seeing you all again in another month or so for the next one. Have a good night, all.
Good night.
Bye now.